So there's another story about King Akbar. But you know, King Akbar was a very great warrior, and he'd conquered a number of lands to make this huge kingdom. But of course, there were other monarchs who also coveted King Akbar's domain. But there was one such king who lived in a neighboring country who would like to invade King Akbar, but he knew that King Akbar had this whiz-bang advisor called Birbal, who was so smart that he was able to thwart any kind of invasions that came along. So he didn't do so. But he was always trying to find ways where he could fulfill his wish to take over King Akbar's domain. So he thought of a ruse. So he sent an emissary to King Akbar suggesting that Birbal be sent to his kingdom as an emissary, an ambassador. So of course King Akbar fulfilled this wish by giving authority to Birbal to go to the neighboring kingdom. Well, when Birbal arrived at that kingdom, he was greeted by the chief advisor of that monarch, who was to escort him into the presence of the king. But the advisor said, "When you enter the king's throne room, you must be certain to greet only the king. If you do not do so, you'll lose your head." So Birbal was escorted into the throne room, and there in front of him were 7 kings, all looking identical. But Birbal went straight over to one of these kings and bowed in front of him, giving him the usual and necessary salutations. Well, the king was very, very surprised, and he said to Birbal, "Well, how did you know that I was the true king?" And Birbal said, "It was very simple, because all the other 6 were looking at you to see what you would do, and you were the only one who was looking at me." Then there's a story about a very young prince. Now, most young boys of this prince's age would be engaged with the games that young boys play, or, such as conjure up an imaginary friend that they could play with if they didn't have playmates and so forth. But this young prince was totally preoccupied with fate and death. Maybe it was because his father's kingdom had been invaded many times. So he'd seen some great warriors and generals who never returned from the battlefield, but gory tales were told about how they died. He'd also seen great famine in his land, during which many people starved to death. So the young prince had been faced with death in many forms. And so his thoughts were often engaged in trying to solve what seemed to be this dilemma of fate and death. But maybe what clinched it for him, set something in place, you might say, was an experience he had one night when he was lying in bed, when suddenly he felt the presence of something in the corner of his room. Now, as he sat bolt upright in his bed, trying to ascertain what it was, he heard a voice. And that voice said, "You can be immortal, but if you hear and listen to the end of this song, you will die." And then the prince heard faint music and words, but he couldn't make out what they were. So he sweated and waited and said, What was it? What was it?" And then, close to his ear, there was an eerie kind of laughter. And again, the faint refrain and words, which he could not make out. But after that, his fear of death and fate grew and grew. It wasn't too long after, when he was still but a young man, that his father, the king, was killed on the battlefield defending his kingdom, and the prince came to be king. But his fear was so great that the first thing he did was to make a law that there was to be no music, no songs in his kingdom. And anyone who dared to break this law would be killed. So no music, no songs, no dancing were permitted in the whole of the king's realm. But it so happened that the king, when he was out visiting another kingdom, met and fell in love with a beautiful princess, gracious. So they were married, and they were totally preoccupied with the exploration of the love that they discovered between them. But then one day, when the king was out in his garden, he heard the sounds of singing. He immediately rushed up to the chamber where his beloved wife was found, in the most beautiful lilting voice, singing a song. He confronted her. "How dare you? Don't you know that there is a law in this kingdom that does not permit song, music, or dance? Not even you can break the laws, when I have incarcerated and killed many who have broken this edict. The queen was totally befuddled by this. How can you make a law such as this? But the king was loath to tell her what was the basis of his fear and the law that had arisen from it. But then the king noticed that his beautiful queen was becoming more and more sad, more and more quiet. She asked him, "Is it that you don't like my voice?" And he said, "No, no, no, no," but again was loath to bring his fear to her. But then, as this worked within him, after a short time, it seemed that there was a great face-off, confrontation, showdown between his fear and his love, ever growing for his beloved wife. After some time, he went to her and he said, "Sing, dance, do what you will. I will rescind the law." And he did, even though in his heart he was still filled with fear. The joy, the delight that he had in seeing his people begin to flower as they sang and danced and made music was greater than the depth of his fear. But his beloved wife, the queen, decided, because it was his 50th birthday coming, that she would have a great reception for him to celebrate. So she invited the best musicians in the land, and she had a song created that would celebrate the king's birthday, which she would sing at this celebration. The reception was held. The musicians were gathered, and his beloved queen got up in her lilting voice and sang. As soon as the king heard this song, he knew this was the song that he had heard in his youth. And a great wave of sadness rose up in him. But as he listened to the melodious sound of his queen's voice and the words of the song that she sang, the joy, the happiness that arose in him was greater than the depth of his fear. As he looked out at the musicians playing, there was one amongst them who seemed to be playing just for him, and him alone. And when the song was finished, that musician beckoned the king out onto the balcony, and the king looked into the eyes of this musician and knew that he was looking into the eyes of death. The musician said to the king, "Why did you listen to and hear the words of this song, knowing that it would bring about your death?" I leave you to answer what it was that the king said to the musician, and what you perceive, live, experience now in your life as the end of this story. What did the king say to the musician in response to his question? Why did you listen and hear the end of this song? Thank you.